The moment Kamala Harris lost control, and the calm reply that silenced an entire arena. It began not with words, but with the sound of her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, stood at center stage, her tone no longer steady, no longer measured. It was sharp, raised, almost trembling with fury. The microphone picked up every vibration, amplifying it until the walls themselves seemed to shake. Gasps rippled across the crowd, the kind of sound you hear when history suddenly swerves off its rails. She leaned forward, her fingers stabbing at the podium, her words tumbling over one another as her voice climbed. Higher and higher. Accusations, condescension, the kind of raw anger that leaves no room for subtlety. For a moment, the audience wasn't sure whether to applaud or recoil. This was not the polished, smiling candidate they had seen on campaign trails. This was something else, a flash of unfiltered frustration spilling out before millions of eyes. The camera panned across the room, capturing faces frozen in disbelief. Some mouths hung open, others whispered to the person beside them. Phones lit up like fireflies, recording, streaming, sending the eruption out to the digital world in real time. On Twitter, hashtags were already forming. On TikTok, clips were seconds away from going viral. But in that moment, before the wave of reaction swept across the globe, there was only silence. All eyes turned to the other podium. Jasmine Crockett stood there, hands steady, expression unshaken. She did not flinch, did not mirror the anger hurled in her direction. Her calm presence stood in jarring contrast to the fury that filled the room. Even as Harris's words echoed and faded, Crockett's silence grew louder, a silence so powerful it seemed to press against every ear in the hall. The crowd leaned forward. They knew something was coming. Because history has shown. U.S. When arrogance screams, dignity waits. When chaos shouts, truth gathers its strength. And in that suspended heartbeat between Harris's outburst and Crockett's reply, the entire arena felt it, the electricity, the anticipation, the question burning in every mind. But no one expected what Jasmine Crockett did next. Every great confrontation begins long before the first shout. This one was no different. The stage lights glared down like unblinking eyes, the kind that magnify every flicker of emotion and make even the smallest gestures feel larger than life. It wasn't just a debate. It wasn't just another speech. It was a moment already freighted with symbolism, a collision of two figures carrying the weight of different Americas. On one side stood Kamala Harris, polished, rehearsed, and battle-hardened. From years in the highest chambers of power, she wore the confidence of a woman who had navigated the most unforgiving arenas of politics. But beneath that confidence, there lurked the edge of something else, the pressure of expectation, the strain of defending her record, the fear of slipping from control. On the other side stood Jasmine Crockett, the rising congresswoman from Texas, her presence electric with the kind of authenticity that cannot be manufactured. Crockett had built her career not on pretense, but on raw conviction, speaking truth with the cadence of someone who had fought for it in courtrooms, in communities, in neighborhoods where trust is earned the hard way. Her supporters didn't just see her as a politician. They saw her as a fighter for dignity, for fairness, for those whose voices were too often ignored. The crowd knew this wasn't an even match in terms of rank or seniority, but that was precisely why it mattered. This wasn't a battle of equals. It was a battle of eras, of power versus principle, of establishment versus insurgency. Harris represented the pinnacle of institutional authority. Crockett embodied the grassroots, the underdog spirit, the refusal to be silenced. And as the debate progressed, tension built with each passing exchange. Harris had been sharp all night, jabbing, with interruptions, her tone growing sharper with every rebuttal. At first, the audience chuckled nervously, unsure if this was strategy or simply impatience. But gradually, the laughter thinned, replaced by a current of unease. You could feel the shift in the air, people leaning in, whispering, sensing that Harris was skating dangerously close to the edge. The moderators tried to regain order, their voices fading against Harris's insistence. Cameras caught Crockett glancing toward her opponent with a steady calm, her lips pressed but her eyes unwavering. She didn't match the heat. She let Harris build her own fire, higher and higher, knowing that flames eventually burn out of control. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about character. It was about who could command the moment without losing themselves in it. The stakes stretched beyond that stage, into households across America where families gathered to watch, into classrooms where young people looked for role models, into communities that have long craved a politics of dignity instead of spectacle. Because everyone knew what was at risk. If Crockett faltered, the story would be written before the night was over, the newcomer crushed by the seasoned veteran. But if she held her ground, if she absorbed the storm and answered with strength, the script would flip entirely. The silence that followed Harris's outburst wasn't just an awkward pause. It was history waiting to be written, a test of whether composure could truly triumph over chaos. And then, in that unbearable quiet, as the nation held its breath, the confrontation transformed from a heated debate into something far bigger. What happened next would turn a routine political clash into a firestorm that no one could ignore. To understand the eruption on that stage, you have to understand Kamala Harris, not just the polished politician in front of the cameras, but the trajectory that shaped her rise and the contradictions that shadowed it. Harris's career has always carried the aura of ambition, the relentless climb from prosecutor to senator to vice president. For years, her sharp questioning and quick wit earned her headlines. She built her brand on being unafraid to confront, to strike, to seize the moment with an authority that could leave opponents scrambling. She was the one who interrupted with precision, who cut through meandering answers with surgical timing. For supporters, this was brilliance. For critics, it was arrogance wrapped in performance. But there's a difference between control and composure. Harris's control had often come from dominating the room, projecting over others, and harnessing volume when persuasion wasn't enough. That approach worked in committee hearings, where sound bites mattered more than nuance. It worked on campaign stages, where zingers could travel further than entire speeches. But over time, the line between sharp and shrill began to blur. Consider her record. As a prosecutor in California, she carried the reputation of being tough. Sometimes too tough. While she spoke about reform, critics pointed to cases that painted a more complicated picture. Moments when she defended policies that disproportionately harmed communities of color, or when she seemed more concerned with winning than with justice. Those contradictions followed her into the Senate, where her fiery interrogations of cabinet nominees thrilled progressives on television, yet left others wondering, was it genuine conviction or just performance for the cameras? And then came the 2020 campaign. Harris entered the presidential race with fanfare, hailed as a top contender, a historic figure poised to reshape the future. But the campaign faltered quickly. The same confrontational energy that drew applause on debate stages failed to sustain. When deeper questions about policy and consistency arose, she clashed, she spiked, she had her viral moments. Yet when the dust settled, voters weren't convinced. Her numbers plummeted. Her campaign ended before a single primary vote was cast. Those scars never quite faded. They whispered beneath every speech, every debate, every interview. They carried the weight of unfulfilled potential of a political star who always seemed to shine brightest in short bursts but struggled to sustain the light. And for Harris, those moments of faltering weren't just political disappointments. They were personal wounds, reminders of the one enemy she could never outshout, doubt. So when she walked onto the stage that night against Jasmine Crockett, all of that history trailed behind her. The weight of expectations, the image of the prosecutor-in-chief, the need to assert dominance, to prove she still commanded the room. And perhaps, beneath the surface, the lingering insecurity that composure alone might not be enough. That insecurity is what people saw break through in that moment. The yelling wasn't just about Crockett's words. It was about years of accumulated pressure, the fear of being overshadowed by a younger, fresher voice, the frustration of being questioned, the exhaustion of carrying a political identity built on strength that now felt harder to project. Harris's voice rising wasn't an accident. It was instinct. It was the old weapon she had always turned to when cornered, volume over vulnerability. But this time, the weapon misfired. The audience saw the contrast too clearly. Where once her sharpness had cut through noise, now it became the noise. Where once her dominance commanded respect, now it drew disbelief. The same tactics that had made her a star years earlier were suddenly undermining her in real time. And Crockett? She was the perfect mirror to make those cracks visible. By saying nothing, by simply holding her ground, she forced Harris's outburst into the spotlight. It was the silence that revealed the arrogance, the calm that exposed the chaos. In that instant, the years of contradictions caught up with Harris. Her past toughness clashed with her present volatility. The ambition that once made her formidable now made her seem desperate. The very image she had built, strong, controlled, unshakable, flickered under the heat of Crockett's stillness. And so the villain of this drama wasn't born in a single scream. She had been forged over years of contradictions, hardened by ambition, sharpened by performance, and finally unmasked by her own unraveling. But here's the twist. Harris thought she was battling Crockett. In reality, she was battling herself. And Crockett, the woman she tried to diminish, was about to show why she was anything but ordinary, to grasp why the arena fell into odd silence at Jasmine Crockett's composure. You have to understand the woman behind the podium, her battles, her scars, her unshakable sense of purpose. Crockett's story didn't begin in marble halls or ivy-draped campuses. It began in the neighborhoods of Dallas, where opportunity was scarce and the odds never seemed fair. She grew up watching communities left behind, hearing promises from politicians that never reached the streets where families struggled just to make ends meet. Those early days weren't just formative, they lit the fire that still burns in her voice today. She didn't enter politics to climb a ladder. She entered because she was already in the trenches. As a criminal defense attorney, she fought case after case for clients who couldn't afford anyone else, people who had been silenced, overlooked, or discarded by a justice system tilted against them. She saw firsthand how dignity was stripped from working families, how arrogance from the powerful crushed those without a voice. Each case was more than legal work. It was training for the battles she would one day fight on a much larger stage. And she didn't forget her roots. Crockett has always spoken in a voice unvarnished by pretense, a cadence that reflects her community and draws strength from it. She speaks like someone who remembers every closed door she had to push through, every moment she was underestimated, every time someone told her she didn't belong. Instead of dimming her light, those moments made her fiercer. When she entered politics, it wasn't with fanfare. It was with grit. She stepped into the Texas legislature not as an insider, but as a fighter who had already weathered the storm of life outside the political bubble. Her colleagues quickly learned she was not one to shrink from confrontation. She wore her boldness unapologetically, sparring when she needed to, standing firm when others wavered. And yet, beneath that boldness lay an even greater strength. Restraint. She knew when to let silence speak louder than any shouted word. That was the foundation of her power, the paradox that confused her opponents. She could be fiery, yes, but she could also be calm, surgical, deliberate. That duality made her dangerous to those who thrived on chaos. Because when you expect fire and get stone, when you hurl insults and meet immovable dignity, the imbalance becomes unbearable. On the national stage, Crockett's authenticity struck a nerve. Young progressives saw in her the reflection of their own frustrations, their own dreams for a politics rooted in truth rather than pretense. Immigrant families saw in her an advocate who understood struggle, who understood what it meant to be dismissed, overlooked, yet still unwilling to bow. Her presence was validation, proof that America's story wasn't just being told by the powerful, but by those who had once been powerless. That night, as she stood across from Kamala Harris, she carried all of that with her. Every courtroom battle, every insult that tried to shrink her, every late night spent fighting for someone no one else would defend. She carried the weight of communities who felt unseen, unheard, forgotten. And more than that, She carried the discipline that comes from knowing when not to swing. Because Crockett understood something Harris had forgotten. Power is not proven by shouting. It's proven by whether you can stand in the storm and remain unmoved. Harris's eruption was meant to intimidate. But intimidation only works on those who fear they might crumble. Crockett had spent her entire career facing storms far harsher than a raised voice. That is why she didn't flinch. That is why her silence grew heavier than Harris's shouting. Crockett knew the battle was already tilting in her direction. Not because she had said a word, but because she hadn't. And that restraint, that calm, wasn't weakness. It was the purest expression of strength. Audiences may not have known her entire backstory in that moment, but they felt it. They felt the gravity behind her stillness, the weight of someone who had carried burdens heavier than the insults hurled her way. They felt that this wasn't a woman surprised by confrontation. This was a woman built for it. And when her eyes met the crowd, they saw more than a politician. They saw a symbol of dignity against arrogance, of calm against chaos, of the America that refuses to be broken by those who shout the loudest. Every step in Crockett's journey had been leading to this exact night. Every struggle had trained her to master composure. Every dismissal had prepared her to stand tall when others tried to diminish her. So when Kamala Harris's voice cracked, under the weight of her own fury, Jasmine Crockett didn't need to raise her volume. She only needed to raise her presence. And in the silence that followed, the nation could sense it. The woman Harris tried to rattle was about to deliver the answer of a lifetime. The silence after Harris's eruption did not last long. The debate stage was charged, the air almost humming with tension. You could feel it in the way the audience shifted in their seats, torn between disbelief at what they had just witnessed and anticipation of what would come next. Harris, flushed with the heat of her own words, tried to press her advantage. She leaned forward, her voice still sharp, doubling down as though volume itself could erase the unease her outburst had left hanging in the air. Answer the question, she barked, her tone sharp as glass. It was the voice of a prosecutor cornering a witness, not of a leader inviting dialogue. Camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of irritation on her face. Her words tumbled faster, louder, each one more biting than the last. But beneath the force, there was something else, the edge of desperation, the faint trace of someone losing command of the very moment they were trying to dominate. Jasmine Crockett did not rush to respond. She didn't interrupt, didn't mirror the hostility. Instead, she allowed Harris to fill the space with sound, allowed the fury to echo and reverberate until it began to collapse under its own weight. Crockett's expression remained steady, her eyes locked on Harris, not with defiance, but with a composure that unsettled even more than shouting ever could. The audience felt the imbalance. You could see it in the way heads turned from one podium to the other, as if searching for stability. Harris was fire, raging, uncontrolled, consuming oxygen. Crockett was stone, immovable, waiting, absorbing. The heat without flinching. The contrast was cinematic, almost too stark to be real, and then the escalation reached its peak. Harris pounded her fist against the podium, her voice straining as she layered accusation upon accusation. She invoked Crockett's record, questioned her readiness, even mocked her youth in politics. It was the kind of broadside designed to crush an opponent under sheer force. Yet, in the very act of delivering it, Harris betrayed the truth. She was rattled. Crockett finally moved. Not with words, not yet, but with the simple gesture of placing her hand on the microphone. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of inevitability. The crowd caught it instantly. Murmurs spread through the room. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moderator tried to interject, but the debate was no longer in their control. This was no longer about policy points or rehearsed talking lines. This was about character laid bare before the nation. One woman was unraveling. The other was gathering her strength. And in that moment, Crockett's restraint became almost unbearable. Every second she delayed her response heightened the suspense. The audience leaned forward, their hearts pounding, their minds racing with questions. Would she lash out? Would she fight fire with fire? Or would she do something entirely different? The stage lights glared down, capturing the sweat on Harris's brow, the calm in Crockett's eyes. The contrast told the story before a single word was spoken. The escalation had reached its boiling point. The next words from Crockett's lips would decide everything: the mood of the room, the spin of the headlines, the direction of the narrative. The arena seemed to hold its breath, caught in that razor-thin space between chaos and clarity. And then, finally, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. What came out of her mouth next would change the room, the debate, and the entire trajectory of the night. When Jasmine Crockett finally leaned into the microphone, the room went silent. It wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Harris's voice still echoed faintly in the air, the trace of her raised pitch clinging like smoke after a fire. Crockett cleared her throat softly, not rushing, not flustered, and then began to speak in a tone so calm, so measured, that it sliced through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Madam Vice President," she said, her voice steady as stone, "I hear your anger. I hear the frustration in your tone, but shouting does not make the truth any louder. And it will not make me any smaller." Gasps erupted. Some in the audience clapped instinctively before remembering they weren't supposed to. The moderator's eyes widened as if they had just realized they were no longer referees of a debate, but witnesses to a moment destined for history books. Crockett let the words hang, not rushing to fill the space. The silence between her sentences was as powerful as the words themselves. She had the crowd in her hands, and she knew it. She continued, "I came here tonight to have a conversation about the people we serve. The mothers working 2 jobs just to pay rent. The veterans who come home and still sleep in shelters. The immigrant families who love this country enough to sacrifice everything for a chance at dignity. Those voices are not raised in anger, they are raised in need. And it is our duty to listen, not to shout over them." The crowd roared. This time, they couldn't hold back. Phones shot up, recording, broadcasting her every word. Clips would be circulating online within seconds, but right now, in that room, the energy was volcanic. Harris shifted uneasily. The camera caught her blinking, lips pressed tight, her earlier bravado draining from her posture. She had expected Crockett to snap back with equal fire. Instead, Crockett turned her fury into a mirror, reflecting it back and exposing the emptiness behind it. Crockett leaned forward, her tone still calm, almost intimate, as though she were speaking directly to every individual in the audience. "I will not apologize for being young in this fight. I will not apologize for being new to this stage. Every single person in America deserves to see themselves represented here. And if my presence makes you angry, Madam Vice President, perhaps it is because I remind you of the people you've forgotten to fight for." A thunderous reaction swept through the crowd, cheers, whistles, even stomps against the floor. Harris's jaw tightened. The cameras lingered on her face, showing the cracks in her composure. Crockett didn't stop. She had momentum now, and her words carried like a rhythm, a sermon, a rising wave. "You call me inexperienced, but I call myself tested, not in the corridors of Washington, but in the lives of the people I've defended. In every courtroom where I stood beside someone told they had no chance. In every neighborhood where folks said politics doesn't care about them. That is my record. That is my experience. And no amount of shouting will erase it." By now the audience was on its feet. Even those who had come undecided found themselves swept into the energy of her delivery. Crockett had taken Harris's aggression and turned it into fuel for her own clarity. The moderators, sensing they were powerless, leaned back and allowed it to unfold. This was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. Then came the line that would echo far beyond that night. "We do not lead America by raising our voices louder than the people we serve. We lead America by lifting their voices higher than our own." The eruption of applause was deafening. The cameras shook as the crowd surged, people standing, clapping, shouting Crockett's name. On social media, hashtags exploded. Hashtag CalmVesChaos. Hashtag Crockett Strong. #DignityWins. Memes were already spreading. Harris frozen mid-shout, Crockett poised in serene stillness. Harris tried to interject, leaning into her own microphone. "That's not," she began, but her voice was drowned out, not by Crockett, but by the audience itself. The room had shifted. The energy had chosen its hero. Crockett raised a hand, not to silence the crowd, but to steady them, and when the applause died down, she finished with a voice that trembled not from anger, but from conviction. "I was not sent here to trade insults. I was not sent here to defend myself against arrogance. Arrogance. I was sent here because America deserves leaders who don't lose control when challenged, who don't scream when confronted with truth. I stand here tonight to prove that dignity will always outlast rage." For a moment, the stage was frozen in time. Harris's eyes darted, her lips pressed tight, her body language betraying the impact of Crockett's words. The vice president, once commanding the room, now looked like a shadow in her opponent's light. The camera zoomed in on Crockett's face, steady and unshaken. The crowd chanted her name. Online, millions watched the clip in real time, jaws dropping, comments flying. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a mic drop that redefined the balance of power. And as Crockett stepped back from the microphone, her final words still hanging in the air, the audience knew they had just witnessed something rare in politics, a moment where truth, dignity, and composure crushed arrogance in front of the entire nation. But the impact of that reply didn't end on stage. It was only beginning. Because as soon as the lights dimmed, the shockwaves of that night would ripple far beyond the walls of that arena. The debate may have ended, but the story was only just beginning. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her calm yet devastating reply, the crowd's eruption marked the birth of something bigger than a single night. It was the kind of moment that lives beyond the stage, one destined to ricochet across every screen, every feed, every conversation in the country. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media. The most shared was only 10 seconds long. Kamala Harris, voice cracking as she shouted, followed by Crockett's serene response, "Shouting does not make the truth any louder, and it will not make me any smaller." Those words spread like wildfire. Twitter timelines lit up. TikTok edits appeared with dramatic music swelling behind Crockett's delivery. Instagram Reels paired her quote with captions in bold, glowing letters. "Dignity beats arrogance." The hashtags trended instantly. #CrockettCom. #MicDropMoment. #Dignity over chaos. Commentators, journalists, and celebrities weighed in. A late-night host tweeted, "Crockett didn't just win the debate, she rewrote the script." A Hollywood actress with millions of followers posted a clip with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." Even rival politicians, ones who had never praised Crockett before, admitted her composure had been remarkable. Meanwhile, Harris's team scrambled to spin the narrative. They tried to reframe her outburst as passion, as fighting spirit. But the images told a different story. The vice president red-faced, leaning over the podium, her voice stretched to breaking. Against the stillness of Crockett, the contrast was undeniable. The memes were merciless. One showed Harris screaming into a microphone while Crockett stood calmly beside her with the caption, "When you lose the argument, but keep the volume." But the reaction wasn't just mockery, it was awe. People across the country, especially young progressives and immigrant families, saw themselves in Crockett's restraint. They saw what it meant to be underestimated, shouted over, dismissed, and to rise above it without losing dignity. For many, it was more than politics. It was personal validation. News outlets rushed to cover the fallout. Panelists on morning shows replayed the clip, pausing to analyze Harris's body language, Crockett's timing, the eruption of applause. Political commentators marveled at how a newcomer had managed to completely overshadow a sitting vice president in the span of just a few sentences. One analyst declared, "This was the night Jasmine Crockett went from promising freshman to national figure." The shockwaves reached beyond politics. Teachers played the clip in classrooms, framing it as an example of calm leadership under pressure. Community leaders cited it in sermons and speeches, describing it as proof that dignity is the greatest weapon against arrogance. For every person who had ever been silenced or underestimated, Crockett's reply felt like a rallying cry. And the online engagement was relentless. TikTok teens reenacted the moment, lip-syncing Crockett's words to dramatic soundtracks. Twitter users made side-by-side clips of Harris yelling and Crockett calmly waiting, captioned, "Patience is power." On YouTube, reaction videos multiplied, with creators shouting into their cameras about how they had never seen anything like this. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came from everyday people. Under one viral clip, a young immigrant wrote, "I've been shouted over my whole life. Watching Crockett refuse to be shaken made me cry." Another user posted, "She reminded me of my mother, who always told me, when they raise their voice, you raise your values." The ripple effect was undeniable. Harris's outburst had become the very symbol of what Crockett was fighting against: arrogance, condescension, the politics of volume over vision. And Crockett's composure became the countersymbol, the idea that true strength doesn't need to scream. By the end of the week, polls reflected the shift. Crockett's national recognition soared. Donations flooded her campaign from small-dollar donors across the country. Meanwhile, Harris's approval numbers dipped, commentators pointing to that night as a turning point in how she was perceived. But beyond numbers and headlines, the moment carried something even larger: moral resonance. People weren't just reacting to politics. They were reacting to the story of dignity triumphing over chaos. They were reacting to the idea that someone could be shouted at, demeaned, diminished, and still stand taller than the one doing the shouting. And as the firestorm raged across the media, one truth became clearer with every replay, every meme, every hashtag. This was more than a debate moment. It was a cultural flashpoint. And in the middle of the chaos, one truth emerged that no one could deny. When the noise of the crowd and the storm of social media finally began to settle, what remained was not just a memory of raised voices or trending hashtags. What remained was a lesson, one that reached far beyond politics. Jasmine Crockett had not only answered Harris's fury. She had reframed the confrontation into a universal truth about leadership, dignity, and the character of America itself. She spoke in interviews afterward with the same composure she had shown on stage. "I wasn't there to outshout anyone," she told the reporter. "I was there to remind people that our job isn't to win arguments. It's to serve. And you can't serve people if you don't respect them." Her words echoed everywhere, a counterpoint to the spectacle of rage that had dominated the stage before. And that was the deeper resonance, the realization that strength is not about decibels, but about discipline. The crowd that night hadn't cheered because Crockett was cleverer or quicker. They cheered because she embodied the values people longed for in their leaders: steadiness, grace, an unshakable refusal to descend into chaos. For immigrant families, her response carried an especially poignant weight. They knew what it meant to be shouted over, dismissed, treated as less than. Watching Crockett hold her ground without anger became more than a political moment. It became a mirror of their own lives. In her stillness, they saw themselves, the quiet strength of endurance, the resilience of dignity under fire. For young progressives, her words offered validation. They had grown up in an era of political brawls where volume often overshadowed vision. Crockett showed them another path, a politics rooted in truth, in calm defiance, in lifting others rather than tearing opponents down. She turned the clash into a lesson. Dignity is louder than rage. Even for those who weren't aligned with her politically, the takeaway was hard to ignore. Commentators admitted that her restraint was not only effective but inspirational. One conservative columnist wrote, almost begrudgingly, "Crockett demonstrated something rare in politics today: the power to win without humiliating herself or her opponent. That's leadership, and that was the heart of it." The moment wasn't about Kamala Harris's anger or even Crockett's reply. It was about what that reply represented: the idea that leadership must rise above ego, that service is greater than ambition, that calm truth can pierce louder than chaos ever could. As the dust settled, Crockett summed it up best in one closing line: America is not defined by who can shout the loudest. It is defined by who can stand the tallest when shouted at. Those words rang out like a creed. They carried the essence of what people wanted to believe about their country: that dignity would always triumph over arrogance, that justice would always outlast fury, that leadership grounded in calm conviction would always prove stronger than leadership shaken by anger. And so, the night that began with a scream ended with a whisper that thundered louder than any outburst. A whisper that carried into homes, classrooms, and communities across the nation. It left people inspired. It left them hopeful. And it left them with a question that lingered long after the stage lights dimmed. If one calm voice could silence chaos in that arena, what else might be possible if dignity became the true language of American politics? And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The stage has emptied, the lights have dimmed, but the echo of that night still reverberates. It was more than a clash of personalities, more than a headline-worthy confrontation. It was a revelation, a moment that showed the entire country the difference between arrogance that shouts and dignity that stands tall. Kamala Harris may have raised her voice, but Jasmine Crockett raised something far greater. A standard for leadership rooted in calm, conviction, and respect. This is why people are still talking about it, why the clips are still being shared, why hashtags are still alive days later. It isn't just because of the drama, though it had all the drama of a cinematic showdown. It's because, deep down, people long for proof that dignity can win. Crockett gave them that proof. She didn't just silence the room. She inspired it. She turned the political spat into a universal reminder that leadership is not measured by volume, but by values. And here's the truth. This story is no longer about a debate stage. It's about us. About whether we, too, will choose dignity over chaos. About whether we'll remember that calm, steady conviction has always been the foundation of the American spirit. So if this moment spoke to you, if it reminded you of the power of holding your ground without losing your grace, don't let it fade. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the movement that says we expect more from those who claim to lead us. Because when we amplify dignity, we amplify ourselves. And that is how we build an America that stands taller than the voices trying to tear it down. Subscribe, share, and stay ready, because this story isn't over yet.